Good morning. This morning's scripture reading will be coming from Mark chapter 14, verses 55 through 60. Mark chapter 14, verses 55 through 60. Now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain testimony against Jesus to put him to death, and they were not finding any. For many were giving false testimony against him, but their testimony was not consistent. Some stood up and began to give false testimony against him, saying, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another made without hands.' Not even in this respect was their testimony consistent. The high priest stood up and came forward, questioned Jesus, saying, 'Do you not answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you?'"
Good morning. It is certainly good to be here. The last Lord's Day of 2018. It's kind of one of those momentous days where we come together and we worship and glorify God as we do each week. And that's what is so momentous about it. It's not who we are, but who He is. And we recognize that. We recognize the King of the universe. We're so thankful that you're here with us. If you're visiting with us, we want you to know that you're welcome and wanted right here at the Brighton Church of Christ, especially if you're looking for a church family to identify with, a group of Christians who are seeking God themselves and seeking to help others get to heaven. That's what we're about here at the Brighton Church of Christ. We invite you to become part of that endeavor as we seek God's face every day. Had a wonderful week this past week. Julie and I did get to go to Oklahoma and spend some time with some family, but one of the neatest things we got to do is just outside of Ardmore, Oklahoma, there's a place called Magnetic Hill. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but if you drive down Magnetic Hill and you get to the bottom of the hill and put your car in neutral, it begins to roll backwards uphill. Yeah, it's a little eerie. Me personally, I think it's an optical illusion, that it's not really the witch just down the road that is cursing anyone coming to her house. But you believe what you want. In Revelation 6, verses 9 and 10, it speaks of those who were slain for their testimony. They're calling out from beneath the altar, "How long, O God?" They're seeking vengeance for their lives that were taken from them as they were cut down short. No doubt in that list of those who are crying out would be Stephen, who in Acts chapter 6 is appointed as one of the special ministers to the Grecian widows, and in Acts chapter 7 and chapter 8 loses his life for the testimony of the Lord. We often refer to them as the martyrs. The word martyrs comes from the Greek martyros, and it means witness, testimony. The root word martys is used, for example, in the book of John 47 different times. In fact, that concept of being a martyr is used by John as one of his great themes. And it's variously translated as a witness, testimony, to testify, false witness. It is a major theme in the book of John. Not only does he use it 47 times in his gospel, but as you go further in his epistles, he repeats the same word or a form of it 17 more times. And then you get to the book of Revelation, and you find that he does it 19 more times. And so over and over and over again, John refers to this word, martus, or martyrs, or witnessing. Mark, on the other hand, only uses the word 11 times in his entire gospel, compared to John's 47. It's not as major a theme for Mark as it was John, but Mark, for his 11 times, 7 of those usages are here in our text this morning. It's as if Mark is waiting and holding this special word for us to consider things about Jesus and the trial. In fact, his emphasis is on the testifying and the witnesses that come at the trial of Jesus, and it is sandwiched between Peter's distance and denial in the book of Mark. In chapter 14, we've already seen two of Mark's sandwiches, where he takes one theme and he sandwiches it between another theme. And here we see it again. In this case, it is the denial of Peter, and it begins in Mark chapter 14, verses 53 and 54, where we are introduced to Peter at his distance and in the courtyard and all the things that are there. And then at the end, we again have an extended part of Peter's denial of Jesus. But there in the middle is the trial of Jesus itself. After being seized in the garden, we would say that Jesus watched all of his disciples leave him one by one. As it says in verse 50, that they all fled away. And how sad that must have been for Jesus. You can imagine how lonely it would have been to begin to feel from the Garden of Eden, or from the Garden of Gethsemane, as they are leading him across the mountain, past the city of David, all the way to the house of Caiaphas, the high priest. They are giving up their personal call to be his witness. He had trained them for 3.5 years, telling them that they were going to be his witnesses, or that they were going to go out and give testimony, that they were to go out and proclaim the gospel as he had been doing for 3.5 years. They are trained specifically for the purpose of giving that testimony, and yet at the time when he's needed most, when they're needed most, he sees them leave. You almost have to wonder, does Jesus, as he watches them go, is he concerned at all that what he is bringing to this world is going to stop? What if these men never come back? In Joe Aldridge's book on evangelism, he tells that story of Jesus getting back to heaven. Remember, the angel said, well, have you told everyone? He said, no. What'd you do? Well, I left the message with my apostles, and they're going to go tell everyone. And the angel is concerned, well, what if they don't? What's your backup plan? And Jesus says there's no backup plan. There's not a backup plan. And so in the garden, as he's watching his disciples desert him, and then you have this curious, unnamed person in 51 and 52 who is seized along with Jesus, and he strips out of his clothes that they've grabbed hold of him by, and he runs naked from the scene. The idea, of course, is that this is another one of those disciples who are following Jesus, and he leaves. Too much speculation has been given and wasted on trying to guess who the young man is. The real question is, why does Mark include it? And the answer is, this anonymous disciple who flees in his nakedness represents any one of us who is willing to turn our backs on the Savior at his darkest hour. They led him, it says, to the high priest in verse 51 or 53, and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes came together. Later it's going to mention and refer to them as the Sanhedrin, or the council. And these are those who are going to determine Jesus' fate. Mark draws our attention to these different witnesses at the trial of Jesus. The account does more than simply further the story as it progresses toward the cross. I think sometimes when we read it, that's all we're reading, the next step in the trials to the cross. But it's more than that. It invites us to see how different people reacted to Jesus. And then it tells us to put ourselves in their place. Where do we stand in the trial of Jesus? What kind of witness are we? Let's join the scene as Jesus is led before that council of an atrocity of justice that is the next step closer to the cross. But it is also an opportunity for us to lay our own hearts and lives before the altar. What kind of witness are we? Are we a broken witness? when it was broken down. That's what Peter was. Notice in verse 54 when it says, Peter had followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he was sitting with the guards and warming himself at the fire. If you go to Jerusalem today and you stand at the city of David or the southern steps of the temple, and you look southwesterly across the valley there, and going up the slope on the other side is a stone stairway that dates back to before the 1st century. And it goes up about halfway up the hill of Mount Zion, and there, just to the left of these stone steps, is a house that also dates back to before the 1st century. It's Caiaphas' house. It's this house where Jesus is led. I stood in that courtyard, and it's very easy to see how the house itself, with its many rooms and its balcony, where Jesus would have been sitting, and Peter in the courtyard just a few feet below, finds himself watching Jesus. Now, Peter follows at a distance, it says. It's interesting because this is more than just a gap in location. It describes really Peter's faith. Not only is there a physical distance between Peter and Jesus at this point, but it appears that there is a spiritual distance that is also growing. The man who had just hours earlier pledged to die for Jesus in verse 31, and even attacked an arresting officer in verse 47, now is seen following at a distance. A lot of people see fear in Peter at this point. I don't see fear. Here's a man who is giving up on that faith. The faith is decaying before our very eyes. He gathers with soldiers openly, probably some of the very ones who were part of the contingent that arrested Jesus in the garden. He is in the open. It's a courtyard, and it's not as if he's over in a corner hiding behind a plant or behind some statue or something. He is right there in the middle of the courtyard, and he's warming himself by the fire, which would naturally light up his face in the darkness, making him more easily identified. That's not the actions of someone who is afraid. He is very comfortable in the company of warriors. Why? Because he is a warrior. He is still looking for a militaristic Messiah. Remember, this goes all the way back to the middle of the book of Mark in chapter 8 when he makes the declaration, "You are the Christ." And Jesus tells him not to tell anyone. And Jesus gives that first passion speech when he says that he's going to suffer and he's going to die. And Peter says, "No, not this way. That's not the Jesus. That's not the Messiah I'm looking for." And when he sees Jesus giving up in the Garden of Gethsemane, I think Peter makes up his mind, this is not him. You remember his statement in John? When all this happens, he says, "I'm going back to fishing. I'm done with this." Peter's faith is dwindling. It is breaking away from Jesus. He is accused of being a follower. We skip down to verse 66 and following. He is below in the courtyard. One of the servant girls of the high priest came, and seeing Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, "You are also with the Nazarene Jesus." If Peter is afraid, why does he come into the glow of the fire? If Peter is afraid, why is he in the open courtyard? If Peter is afraid, why is he not in some obscure house on the northern side of Jerusalem, far away from what's happening here? Peter's not afraid. Peter's a warrior. He's standing with the warriors. And it's almost as if he's wiping his hands and saying, "Good riddance to this impostor." He says to the woman, or to the servant girl, "I neither know him nor understand what you mean." Later, when he's accused again the third time, he says, "I do not know this man of whom you speak." his response widens the gap between him and Jesus. He's at a distance, and the distance is growing. The two terms that he uses for knowing Jesus, I do not know what you mean, and I do not know him, indicates both a theoretical knowledge, I don't know who this man is supposed to be, as well as a practical knowledge. I have not known him intimately as one of his servants. He completely denies knowing Jesus, and this, I think, reflects a desire to remain anonymous, or it may reflect a desire to remain anonymous, but I think more likely it reveals that decay of attachment to Jesus. He's starting to distance himself from this man who was not what he thought he was supposed to be. He didn't fit into Peter's mold. He moves away from the open courtyard and the fire there, and it says that he goes into the entry of the gate. Now understand, the entire courtyard would have been lit up with torches and so forth, but he goes to the entry of the gate, which if you stand at the entry of the gate, you're even further away than you were before. In other words, he moves further away physically as well. The imperfect tense of the second denial, it says that he denied him, but it's imperfect, showing that the action was not completed. It is an extended over and over and over denial. He is adamant that I do not know. I'm not one of those that goes with him. Not only is Jesus moving farther away from Jesus, he is moving further away from Jesus at the same time. And then you see in the third denial, Peter curses and swears. This could mean that Peter is using profanity to change his speech and to further remove himself from Jesus. But it could also mean that he is swearing by God and invoking heaven itself upon him, which is an even greater profanity. He cannot even speak the name of Jesus. He doesn't say, I do not know him. But he says, I do not know this man. There is a certain amount of disgust in Peter toward Jesus. And then the rooster crows that second time. And it says that he remembered what Jesus had said. Before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And he broke down and wept. Whatever Jesus may have been turning into as far as Peter was concerned, he at least told the truth. His prophecy was real. And Peter was a broken man. Now, it's interesting. Throughout chapter 14, Mark uses the apostles as the foil. First it's Judas, and then it's all the apostles, and now it's Peter. Peter and his complete denial. In the end, he's a broken witness, and maybe that's us. Maybe our attachment to Jesus is not strong enough to be the kind of witness that he needs us to be. Maybe our lives are so separated from him that our example is a broken account of what it means to be a follower of Christ. We are supposed to be witnesses, testimony, giving the testimony of Christ. Paul would say to Timothy, he says, what you have heard from me, the testimony that I have given you, the same testimony you commit to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. You see, that testimony is passed from generation to generation to generation, and we're just another link in that chain. And is our witness broken? Are we surrounded by those who need to hear and yet remain silent? Have our attachment to Christ corrupted and decayed. But in Mark's account, there's another witness. Not the broken witness, but the corrupt witnesses. In verse 53, they're introduced, the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes. Then we see them again in verse 55. The chief priests and the whole council were seeking testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. The whole council, the Greek word here is Sanhedrin. It's talking about the Sanhedrin council. The corruption of the council is seen in their predetermination of Jesus' guilt. You remember in Acts chapter 2, it says that he was delivered to the determinate council. The determinate, or a council that is predetermined, is not one that is seeking justice. The travesty of justice comes from those who know the laws, who know the type of proceeding this is supposed to be, but will suspend them for the good of the nation. You'll recall in John 11, verse 50, when one of the leaders stood up and he said, "Do you not understand that it is better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish?" We're doing it for the good of the country, national security. Chief priests and the scribes and the elders, these were the very ones that Jesus, after his triumphal entry into Jerusalem in Mark chapter 11, tells the great parable in the first paragraph of chapter 12 of the vineyards and the unfruitful, unprofitable, evil, wicked tenants. And he's speaking to, according to chapter 11 and verse 27, the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. It's the same group of people. And they're offended in chapter 11 and chapter 12, and they're offended again. They're understood to be the council, the Sanhedrin. You've got to understand that the Romans were smart enough to see that the Jews were a very curious people. They claimed to follow God. They refused to follow Roman ways and Roman ideals and Roman traditions. And instead of pushing their thumb down harder upon them, the Romans kind of took a step back and allowed them to see to their own affairs in things that Rome did not consider important, and allowed them to appoint a council of elders, of educated men called the Sanhedrin. In religious matters, in minor civil matters, they would have authority. And then, of course, for capital matters, such as capital punishment, insurrection, anything against Rome, they would make recommendations to the Roman governor, but ultimately the Roman governor would have the say. This becomes then like a pre-trial hearing. If we can get Jesus, if we can show that he is guilty and that he is worthy of death, then we'll turn that over to the next highest step, which is the Roman governor himself. The high priest, according to John, was Caiaphas. He is getting nowhere with the false witnesses. And so he stands up and takes matters into his own hands, and he asks, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" In the Greek, "you" is emphatic. It's almost as if he is sarcastically saying, "Are you the Christ? Do you really think that you are the Son of the Blessed One?" The term "blessed one" was a common Jewish reference to God. You know how the Jews were always afraid of taking the Lord's name in vain. And so they had a myriad of terms in which they would refer to God. And one of the popular ones was the Blessed One. He is asking Jesus, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of God?" Thus, without knowing, he gives Christ the full Christological recognition of everything that Jesus has spoken and everything that Jesus had did. You know, the only other time that we see this confession is made is at the death by the centurion. Both of them are Romans. And yet they make, in this case, an unwilling declaration of Christ's identity. But because their hearts were so hardened, because they didn't want to know who Jesus really was, they didn't want justice. They just wanted Jesus dead. They were corrupt witnesses. There's another group of witnesses. Mark identifies them as false witnesses. Mark says many false witnesses came forward, and by definition, their testimony is a lie. Either they did not witness what they said they witnessed, or they saw it but have embellished it in such a way that would condemn Jesus, or worse, they simply composed their testimony. They made it up, having not been there and not known what had happened. By law, a capital offense was only punishable by the mouth of two or more witnesses. No person shall be put to death on the testimony of one witness, Numbers 35 and verse 30. Deuteronomy 17 and verse 6, the mouth of two or three witnesses, Deuteronomy 19 and verse 15. By law, they had to have more than one witness. But notice the interesting thing about these witnesses. Many bore witness in verse 56, bore false witness against him, but their testimony did not agree. They had plenty of witnesses, but they can't get their story straight. That's always the case with lies. When you embellish a story, the embellishments need to agree, but in their case, they couldn't get it to agree. Even when they settled on one particular accusation, that he claimed he was going to tear down the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. But even on this, it says they could not agree. Now notice, the chief priests and the council, they're looking for someone. They don't care if it's a false witness. They just need the testimony to agree, and they can't get that. The problem with false witnesses is that they rarely come together. They rarely find agreement, even when their testimony is on the same event. Truth will always prevail. Lies cannot compete with the truth. So that leaves one witness left. One lone witness. As Jesus is being accused, the first part of his witness is that he remains silent. His witness is seen in the fulfilled prophecy of Isaiah, of the suffering servant. Isaiah 53 and verse 7 says that as the sheep before her shears is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. That's part of his great witness, was the very silence that he offered. But why? Why is he silent up to this point? What does he have to lose? Why doesn't he at this moment perform great feats of power? Why not at this moment condemn the chief priests in their corruption? Why not expose the lies of the false teachers? Why not say to Peter, do you want to take that back? Do you want to change your stance? But Jesus remained silent. The answer is he'd been speaking the truth all along. He didn't speak it in private. He wasn't afraid. He spoke it openly. Everything he'd ever taught was available. There's no need to defend that. His witness is seen in his own prediction of the trial. Chapter 10, see, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles, and they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him, and after 3 days he will rise. Mark 10, 33 and 34. Verse 65, Some began to spit on him, cover his face, and strike him, saying, "Prophesy." The guards received him with blows. It is just as he prophesied. That's a witness to who he is. His witness is seen in his prediction of Peter's denial. 3 times you will deny me before the cock crows a second time. With the first denial, the first rooster crow comes, and then the second denial, and then the third denial, and at the third denial, the second cock crow. His witness is seen in his own words. An answer to the high priest who says, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? Jesus says, I am. The shades of the great I am statements of John. Ego eimi. Harkening all the way back to Exodus 3 and verse 14. When they ask, who sent you? You tell them, I am has sent you. The high priest asks, are you the Christ, the Son of God? Jesus says, I am. I am both the Christ and the Son of God. The Jews had never really put those two together. They were not expecting the Son of God and the Messiah to be one and the same. And it's not Jesus' declaration that he is a Christ that offends the high priest. There were plenty of people who had called themselves Messiah prior to and after Jesus that don't get treated this way. It's the declaration that he is the Son of God that offends the priest and the council. Then calling to mind the prophecy of Daniel, when he says in the rest of his defense, you will see the Son of Man seated on the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. Hearkening back to Daniel 7 and verse 13, behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like the Son of Man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him, and the Ancient of Days being the Father, and Jesus riding on the clouds to the very presence of God. He also brings in Psalm 110 and verse 1, the Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. These verses would equate this Son of Man and this Lord who said unto my Lord, that they are in fact deity themselves, that they are God. Jesus is putting himself in the place of God. He affirms his divine nature. He affirms his relationship to God. He affirms his messianic role, and he does it in the most direct way possible. Until this point, he has not allowed the full disclosure of his identity. Remember in chapter 1 and chapter 3, the demonic possessed people are saying, what have you to do with this, you Son of God? And Jesus silences them. He will not allow them to speak his true identity. We've realized that part of that is because of the misunderstanding of the messianic part, that he is the Son of God and that he's the Messiah, but the part that is the secret that is held until now is that suffering aspect. Jesus must suffer. And when he starts to tell it, his disciples balk at that idea. Not so, Lord. Now all of a sudden, we see his messiahship, we see his sonship, and we see them come together in the midst of suffering itself. And now is the time. Now is the time to proclaim it. Finally, at last, the messianic secret is revealed in the midst of the suffering. He can finally proclaim the full truth. Do they understand it? The high priest grabs his garments and he rips them open. What more witnesses do we need? All of us who sit here have heard from his own lips. Heard what? That he claims to be God. That's enough. The blasphemy, the horror, the sin, the iniquity. Jesus, ironically, at his trial, provides the testimony that signs his death warrant. The liars couldn't do it. The disciples weren't there to do it. Peter was there, but he's distancing himself from it. The corrupt witnesses of the chief priests and the council, they don't want to do it. So the damning piece of evidence is provided by the Lord himself. Mark contrasts really in all of this. There's two witnesses that he is focused on. Obviously, that of Jesus. The other one, not so much the false witnesses in the council, but it's Peter. Peter is the one who reveals to us the true lesson. That is that true discipleship offers a faithful witness to Christ every day. Peter finally exchanged the cross for a life of ease. Right? Jesus had told them, if you're going to follow after me, you've got to take up your cross and follow me. The cross implies something that is burdensome. It's heavy to carry. And when push came to shove, Peter said, I think I'll lay this down. To be a witness of Jesus was too heavy for Peter in that moment. But Jesus, in contrast, continues to proclaim over and over and over again. His testimony is consistent. He's the Son of God. He's the Messiah. And this bit of suffering that he has to endure is part of the plan of God. Most often our witness breaks down in simple, everyday situations. We're not often put on trial for our testimony. Not many are killed because of their testimony for Christ. But it's those moments where the name of Christ is being abused or put down, and instead of speaking up, we remain silent because the burden of speaking up is too heavy. It's in the grocery stores, it's at work, it's at school, it's at home when we're talking with members of our family or friends that don't believe in Christ. And we're too afraid, or we're too tired, or we just have too good an etiquette to rock the boat and speak up for the Christ. If Peter is the witness for Mark, which I believe he probably is, and he's telling Mark, I followed at a distance, and I got further and further and further away. Why is he focused so much on his story? This is what I love about Christianity. We don't try to soft soap our heroes, cover over their faults and foibles. Here's Peter, very much the forefront of the apostles, and yet he has made not one, not two, but 3 denials of Jesus in his very darkest hour. There's trials. Fled away. They say, how? Why does the church keep telling that story about Peter? It's because that story tells us about the grace of God. You see, after all of that, Peter still came back. Peter raced to the tomb. Peter saw him in the upper room. Peter came back. And no matter how far apart from God we may be, no matter what distance we've put between us and Jesus, and even if that distance is growing wider and wider and wider, there's no point in our lives where we are so far from Jesus that he cannot reach us. So estranged from God that his grace can't reach us. No matter where you are, you can come back. Maybe that's what you need to do this morning. Maybe you've separated from God, and it's time to reunite with him. It's time to obey the gospel. You said, well, I wasn't ready yesterday, but today I'm ready. You know, God's always ready, and we're always ready to receive him. If this morning you're ready to respond, won't you come while we stand and while we